Okay, with the establishment of the North American colonies, the English colonies, North America, what we're going to do now is we're going to review each and talk about its development in the 18th century, going from 1700 to about 1770. We'll begin with a few preliminary remarks about the colonies as a whole. Then we'll talk about New England, and then the middle colonies, and then the southern colonies, and then we'll talk about some of the unifying experiences that happened within the colonies, which sort of engender this us against them mentality towards England as we move forward. Now, by 1717, the North American colonies are not the focus of British interest. We'll talk a little bit more about a concept called salutary neglect in a little bit. We're not the focus. As a matter of fact, we're usually considered more trouble than we're worth. The little tiny island of Barbados, right there, according to this chart, produces 3 times more wealth than the rest of the British colonies in North America put together. 3 times more wealth. And per capita, the West Indies provinces produces 538 shillings per person, as opposed to 39 and 15 shillings per person. So what we're looking at is we aren't the focus of English attention. We are not the ones that they are focusing on. They really are paying attention to Barbados, and it's no surprise. This is the whole Pirates of the Caribbean sort of thing. All of the wars against sugar, fighting for sugar, and all of this kind of stuff. What we do in the colonies is we provide staple resources, things that are necessary, but not luxuries, not extremely valuable, but necessary. So this idea that the British colonies in North America are actually kind of left alone, and as long as we don't cost them anything, they don't really have to pay attention to us very much, which causes us to do a lot of little things. Now, the economy, this is what's going on with the population. In 1700, all of British North America has about 250,000 people. By 1770, there's over 2 million people. Now, we're going to put this into a sort of perspective that can maybe help us understand what's going on. The population in the colonies is exploding, while the population in England is still increasing. At its normal rate, the population in the colonies is exploding. Okay? In 1700, there were 19 people in England for every colonist. So there were 19 people on the island in England for every 1 colonist in the New World. By 1770, there were only 3 people in England for every colonist. Most people believe that by 1800, the population in the colonies would have far outstripped the population back in England. At least that was Benjamin Franklin's understanding. He believed by 1800 there would be so many more people that, according to his biographies and some of his letters, he half-heartedly believed that the people of the government of England might even shift its power base to the New World. So this is what's going on with the population. The question is why? So what is this going on? There's 2 primary reasons for this population increase. The first, immigration, but the second, natural increase. Okay? Now, as far as immigration, in 1670, 9 out of 10 people in the colonies are from England. Okay? And 1 out of 25 are of African origin. By 1770, only half of the population in the colonies was of English origin, and over 20% of the population is of African origin. So immigration does make an impact as far as the increase in the population, but it only constitutes for 1/4 of the population increase. The natural production, natural increases accounts for 3/4 of the population growth. That basically means having babies. They're having families, massive, massive families. With their expanding economy and the abundance of resources, these guys are able to, they're able to have children, lots of children. Depending on the mortality rate, it would to be their benefit to have a lot of children, since sometimes children die in their early years. Most of the people in 1700 still live within 50 miles of the coast. I think this is almost a psychological thing. It's almost like having an apron string or having an anchor, that if you stay within 50 miles of the coast, you've always got England to look back to. You've always got England there. England is always just on the other side of the water. But from 1700 to 1770, this changes. People start moving into the back country, well beyond the 50-mile limit. Most people believe that the reason this shift is a psychological reason, that we no longer fear not being connected to England. It's during this time period, it is kind of sort of this psychological coming of age, that we feel comfortable now here, that we can make it here, and so the risks of moving inland have diminished significantly. So a lot of people point to that, to some of the change in the attitudes of these colonists as these years move forward. Okay, land was cheap, but land without labor was worthless. Land had to be worked. Property by itself is worthless. It needs to produce something. When the property produces something, that's where wealth is created at that point. Okay. This creation of wealth in the New World is going to allow for a mushrooming population, which is going to cause this, again, massive population increase. Now, New England, going from the Puritan settlers to the Yankee traders. Okay, we're going to talk about the natural increase plus land distribution, the way New England, we're going to recap how New England had dealt with its carbon copying of cities, and we're going to talk about the trade, what it is that these folks in New England are going to do to make their money. Okay, population only grows sixfold in the 1700s, which is the least amount of all three of the regions. Okay, one of the problems is the remnant of the Puritan orthodoxy. They're still stuffed shirt. They're still sort of obsessed with the Puritan orthodoxy. Okay, so they don't attract the religious dissenters or the people indifferent to religion. And the people to land ratio is also part of the problem. Initially, towns, based on these charters of these Puritan communities, towns receive land, and the town divvies up the land amongst the settlers. From 1700 to 1770, that's also going to change. Trade is going to become the faith that's going to compete with Puritanism. Trade is going to be the thing. These guys are going to become the merchant class of the New World, and it's going to give Puritanism a heavy competition. Okay, in these communities, almost every adult woman is married, and most married women have children. We're talking lots of kids, 6, 7, 8, 12, oodles of children. Okay, Benjamin Franklin's father is basically a prime example. Franklin's father had 7 children with his first wife, and then she died, and his second wife, he had 10 children. So this is the norm in these communities during this time period. Now, in the mid-1600s, land was granted to towns and then divided up based on the needs of the family. Okay, But by the 1700s, land will start being sold to individuals. Individuals will start purchasing up multiple tracts of land. As I said, they are going to become the merchant class. The folks in West Massachusetts are going to be focused on farming, but the people in the Eastern Massachusetts aren't going to worry so much about the farming as they are about the trade industry, the fishing industry, and the craft industries. Okay, people start spreading out in the New England area at this point. Farms are normally small family farms, except for a few of the farms in the western reaches. Usually very little surplus to sell on market. It's usually sustenance farming. They are going to develop trade industries and start selling and shipping things to the south. For example, clockmakers and printers and metalsmiths and carpenters and cabinet makers and things like this are going to find very lucrative businesses opportunities in the New England colonies. Okay, lumber was extremely abundant in the western, and so what they're going to do is they are going to start building ships. Out of all the things that are restricted by the Navigation Acts, shipbuilding is not one of them. New England is allowed to build its own ships, which allows for them to start their own shipping industries and their fishing industries. Shipping and fishing are going to be over a third of the exports that leave the entire region. The export of codfish to Europe and to the West Indies is going to be an economic boon for the region. Codfish are in abundant supply in the North Atlantic, and as they ship these goods to both England and to the West Indies, it's a cheap, inexpensive food source for working class people. Okay. In your text, you have this, where your text will refer to it as a trade triangle. Basically, what's happening because of the Navigation Acts, which restricts the kinds of products that can be manufactured in the New World, what's going to happen is resources are going to be harvested here. And the harvested resources are going to be sent to Europe, sent to England for the most part. Coming back from England are manufactured goods, manufactured goods, manufactured goods, manufactured goods. So England is going to manufacture materials while the colonies are going to focus on harvesting the resources necessary for that manufacture. And then from North America to Europe, and then especially in the southern colonies and Africa, we're going to have this trade triangle that your text will refer to, this trade triangle between Europe, Africa, and the New World. This map, I think, the other map, this earlier map, shows us the kinds of things that are being shipped and traded. And it's good for that information, but the thing that I find most interesting is this second map that I found that I want to share with you. The blue lines is the trade controlled by American shipping. The red lines are the trade controlled by the British shipping industry. Originally, all of these lines were red. Originally, all of those lines were controlled by British interests. But when we go from 1700 to 1770, the Americans start taking control of their own trade industries. So the only thing, as you can see here, the only thing that the British control as far as trade is concerned is the manufactured goods that are sent back to the New World. Everything else leaving the colonies and much coming into the colonies is controlled by American shipping ventures. This is going to cause New England to be much more self-sufficient economically from England than they were in the beginning. Many of these New England folks are going to wonder why we need to be focused on English economic interest when we have our own economic interest. So again, this map is very interesting in the ability to show how this sort of economic sort of swing happens during this period. Now, the middle colonies. The middle colonies, especially Pennsylvania, are going to become sort of the breadbasket of the colonies. All right, this breadbasket. In 1700, twice as many people lived in the middle colonies as lived in New England. Middle colonies, we're talking about New York and Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Okay, so the idea is that in 1700, twice as many people live in the middle colonies that do in New England. By 1770, the population in the middle colonies has increased tenfold. So that population difference is going to skyrocket. This is where the vast majority of the population increase is going to happen. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and Delaware. So why the population increase? Well, there is immigration. There is immigration. You've got the German, the Irish, and that shouldn't say Scotch. That should say the Scots. And other groups are going to come to Pennsylvania because of William Penn and his open toleration for all religions and groups and things like that. And so Pennsylvania, specifically Philadelphia, is going to, its population is going to skyrocket. But the biggest reason, well, this also creates a very diverse population. And most people believe this is why a lot of the success stories that happen in Pennsylvania happen because of this diverse flow of information and people from different cultures. Okay, by 1800, a third of the people in Pennsylvania traced their family back to England, and less than half of the population of the middle colonies trace their origins back to England. This shouldn't be surprising since, as a matter of fact, New York was founded, the middle colonies, most of the middle colonies were founded by the Dutch to begin with. Okay, so their ancestors wouldn't be traced back to England to begin with. But this idea that immigration here is going to have more of an impact than anywhere else in the colonies, except it is not the primary reason. The primary reason for the population increase in middle colonies is still natural increase. Now, the Germans were the largest group to immigrate. Most of them are Protestant. By 1770, over 8,500 Germans have arrived in the middle colonies and are attempting to set up shop. Most of them are artisans and craftsmen, and many will be farmers. And we're going to refer to them as the Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, again, it's a misnomer. They are German. They are not Dutch. The reason we call them the Pennsylvania Dutch is because when you ask them, do you speak English, they say, Nein, ich sprechen Sie Deutsch. Deutsch is the German word for German. And so the English people just mistook this notion of Deutsch for Dutch. And so hence we call these guys the Pennsylvania Dutch. Again, ignorance. Most come from southwestern Germany. 1702 to 1713, Queen Anne's War between the French and the Germans. We're going to have a lot of these folks coming across the ocean. A lot of the Moravians, a lot of the Pietist movement are going to come because of basically they're pacifist groups who want nothing to do with the warfare that's taking place. By 1720, Germans will write back home and tell their family members of the religious liberties and freedoms that they're allowed to have in Pennsylvania, and they will start coming in droves. Most were Lutheran, Reformed, or Pietists. As I said, the Pietists, the Mennonites and the Amish come from this Pietist group, which will essentially a kind of reform movement that is sort of takes no oaths, swears no loyalty to countries, only loyal to God, etc., etc. But they are pacifists as far as conflict is concerned. They refused to bear arms. They refused to take oaths, things like that. Now, Scots-Irish also is a misnomer. These folks are usually from Ireland. Mostly very militant Presbyterians, Protestants from this area. They're going to come to the New World, and they are going to settle in the backcountry of the Middle Colonies. Now, many of these very militant Scots-Irish are going to migrate south down the Appalachian Trail and wind up around here in our backcountry. The reasons why, none of you have ever wondered why we have so many Celtic festivals and Scottish festivals back here, is because most of the people who came early and settled on this side of the mountain were of this Scots-Irish sort of very militant Protestant background. They wanted to be separate from England. They wanted nothing to do with old Mother England, because they never considered England their mother to begin with, right? When asked why they're leaving Ireland, why they're leaving Scotland, deteriorating economic conditions is the primary reason, and they head this direction. In 1717, it starts waves of immigration. By 1773, they make a simple questionnaire asking, taking surveys of people as they're leaving England. Why are you going to the New World? And it's basically all the same answers that you hear to people who want to migrate to the United States today. They're out of work back home. They're living in poverty back home. The landlords are terrible. They want a better life, and so they're coming here, right? They've heard that this is a land of opportunity, and so they're going to come here. Most aren't ready for the trip. Most are broke when they arrive at the coastal cities, and they're forced to sign on as sort of indentured servants to make the passage to get here, okay? This notion, except for these guys, it's a new kind of indentured called a redemptioneer. They become redemptioneers. They had heard that this new world was a haven. It was a haven for the artisan and the farmers, and a paradise. And so they wanted to come to have a better life, to make a better life for themselves. The way it worked, a servant would come into the Middle Colonies. Men would usually work in the shops as storekeepers and learn the trade. Women would work in households as cooks, as laundresses. Usually these servants could be purchased for 4 to 7 years at the cost of about what would constitute 4 months' wages back then. So even wages are on the increase for these guys. And at the end of their indenture, they receive their freedom. And hopefully they've gained some kind of trade or the ability to take care of themselves after this fact. Now, by 1770, Western expansion is the norm. Remember I said all the dark places here are where settlements happened prior, right, by 1700. By 1770, these new settlers are following these rivers into the backcountry, up into the mountainous areas. And they're following these rivers going into the Appalachian Mountains and settling on the other side. Okay? Again, I believe it's psychological, this idea that they've come to a point to where now they are sort of free from the idea that they need to be tied to England. They start heading into the backcountry because now they're confident in the ability to take care of themselves. Okay? And so as these settlers, as immigration starts happening, and as more and more families become bigger and bigger and bigger, when the children get older, the children want to spread out too. They don't want to still live on mom and dad's farm. They want their own farm, and they head out west. Okay? Farmland is cheap, and it's extremely plentiful, and these people are able to set up shop and get started basically where they are. Now, there were also originally in Pennsylvania a few slaves in Pennsylvania and New York. Matter of fact, in Franklin's autobiography, Franklin says when he first became successful in Philadelphia, one of the first things he did was he purchased 4 slaves. He purchased 4 slaves. One was a cook, and then he had his valet, and then he had 2 men who worked in his stables, took care of his carriage and his horses. However, Franklin, coming from a Quaker family, Franklin quickly has pangs of guilt about this idea of owning other human beings. And Franklin will free his slaves and then give them employment. He will hire them as freed workers in his employ. By 1770, slaves only constitute about 7% of the population. And so eventually in Pennsylvania, by 1774, 1775, the first abolitionist society is established in Philadelphia by Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, one of the first essays he writes for the new magazine that he's writing for in Pennsylvania is about slavery, the abolition of slavery. Again, Thomas Paine, coming from a Quaker background, is going to be appalled by the concept of slavery. And so the middle colonies are going to become an early and persistent voice against the institution of slavery as we move forward. Now, in the next one, we're going to talk about the southern colonies and the Atlantic slave trade in the British colonies. And then we're going to discuss sort of unifying events that caused the colonists to sort of become on the same sheet of music.